What a bloody circus, mate. Imagine being the Prime Minister of Australia, strutting into a so-called bush summit in Ballarat, and instead of handshakes and applause, you get booed out by angry farmers and literally chased out of town like some unwanted pest. That's exactly what happened to Anthony Albanese and Jacinta Allen. And you know what? No one in Canberra wants to talk about it because it exposes a brutal truth. People out in the regions have had an absolute gutful of being treated like second-class citizens. The mainstream press calls it a rowdy reception. Please. This wasn't just a bit of booing at the footy. Farmers told them to rack off, loud, public, and unfiltered. It was the clearest message, yet that rural Aussies reckon the city slicker pollies are full of it. Before we dive into the Ballarat bloodbath, where Albanese got booed, Jacinta Allen copped it, and farmers chased the PM out like a stray roo, smash that like button like you're slamming the door on Canberra's spin machine. Subscribe if you're sick of being ignored by pollies and want the raw, unfiltered truth. And grab the Can I Vote for a Kangaroo shirt, links in the description. Wear it when your rent spikes, your power bill triples, or the next politician dares tell you everything's fine while the country's burning. You want controversy? Here it is. The divide between city and country in Australia is at breaking point, and our leaders are pretending it doesn't exist. Farmers in Victoria aren't just annoyed about one policy here or there. They're furious at being told how to live by people who've never pulled a lamb out of a paddock or watched their livelihood wither in a drought. These people work their guts out, and then the government turns up, wagging the finger about climate targets, net zero deadlines, and land use rules that make farming almost impossible. It's no wonder they booed Albanese and Allen until their faces turned red. Out there in Ballarat, they didn't just see politicians. They saw the enemies of their way of life smiling for the cameras while ignoring the damage their decisions cause every single day. But here's the spicy bit no one wants to touch. The whole net zero debate is a giant scam, and the farmers know it. They know that shutting down coal and gas and forcing people into renewables isn't about saving the planet. It's about money and control. At that same summit, Barnaby Joyce tore strips off Chris O'Keefe, the Clean Energy Council's talking head, and the crowd loved it. O'Keefe rattled on about how great we're going with renewables, but Barnaby hit him with the truth. Our power bills are higher than Uruguay, El Salvador, and bloody Honduras. Honduras. And here's O'Keefe trying to spin a fairy tale while farmers can't even afford diesel for their tractors. The audience wasn't having a bar of it because they live with the consequences. They're the ones paying sky-high bills and watching industries collapse while city pollies tell them to think of the environment. And let's not kid ourselves. It's not just about power bills or clean energy. It's about migration, land, water rights, and the feeling that ordinary Australians are being shoved aside for agendas cooked up in boardrooms and global summits. A pamphlet floated around pointing out that in just 5 years, more people from India had arrived in Australia than Greeks and Italians since World War II. That stat alone set off alarm bells, not because migrants are bad, but because people see the numbers exploding while infrastructure is buckling. Try getting a rental in Melbourne or a GP appointment in Sydney and tell me we don't have a problem. But instead of tackling it honestly, what did a Labor senator do? Burst into tears on the Senate floor, whinging about racism. No racism was even mentioned, it was a numbers issue. But crying on the floor of Parliament gets sympathy points, doesn't it? Until, of course, you get ratioed on Twitter so hard you lock your account. That's what happened. And while all this drama unfolds, Donald Trump is back in the White House as the 47th President of the United States. Think about that. The bloke who got impeached twice, dragged through courts, and mocked endlessly by the media is now running the show again. And Australians can laugh all they like, but Trump's victory is a slap in the face to every global elite who thought they'd finally buried him. Meanwhile, we've got Albanese running for the hills in Ballarat, hiding from angry farmers. Which leader looks stronger to you? The one who bulldozed through every scandal and clawed his way back into power, or the one chased out of a country town by a mob of people with akubras and megaphones? It's embarrassing, mate. Utterly embarrassing. But here's the kicker. In Australia, the opposition is now led by Susan Ley, the first woman to ever hold the role. You'd think that would be a massive headline, a historic shift. But barely anyone's talking about it. Why? Because Australians don't believe the political system will change, no matter who's at the helm. Whether it's Ley, Albanese, Dutton, or ScoMo, people reckon they're all just puppets for the same faceless forces. And maybe they're right. How else do you explain policies that nobody actually wants, like forcing EV targets on farmers who can't even get charging stations within 200 kilometers of their property? The whole show feels stitched up, and the audience is sick of watching. And don't get me started on how the media spins all of this. You turn on the ABC, and they'll tell you the crowd in Ballarat was frustrated or concerned. Nah, mate. They were furious, spitting mad, and they made it known in a way that no politician could mistake. But the cameras won't show you the raw footage of the Prime Minister being booed and jeered off the stage, because that would reveal the truth that Australians are waking up. They're realizing that polite letters to Parliament don't work, that voting every 3 years doesn't change much, and that maybe, just maybe, it's time to start booing louder and demanding real answers. And that's just scratching the surface, because if you think Ballarat was bad, wait until you see what's bubbling under the surface nationwide. Farmers, tradies, renters, migrants, business owners, they're all angry, but for different reasons. And when anger from all sides collides, politicians can't just hide in Canberra. They'll get chased out of town, just like Albanese did. And if the government keeps ignoring it, we might just be looking at one of the biggest political upheavals in Aussie history. Alright mate, let's dive straight back in, because where we left off was just the beginning of the chaos. Remember how I said the anger in Ballarat was just the tip of the iceberg? Well, buckle up, because what's happening in the bush isn't isolated, it's spreading like wildfire. Farmers aren't just cranky about one bad decision here or there, they're starting to treat every single politician as an intruder. And when people in rural towns turn their backs on government altogether, that's when you know the cracks in the system aren't just surface level, they're deep and dangerous. What happened in Ballarat wasn't a protest, it was a warning shot. A warning that the next time a poly dares roll up with their convoy of taxpayer-funded cars, they might not just get booed, they might get run out for good. And if that happens, you can kiss goodbye to the idea that quiet Australians still exist. Quiet? They're bloody roaring now. The wildest thing about the Ballarat fiasco is how quickly the story was buried. You'd think the Prime Minister getting booed and chased out of town would be front-page news, wall-to-wall coverage. But nah, most outlets buried it under puff pieces about EV subsidies and photo ops with school kids. The reason's obvious. Showing the Prime Minister being humiliated like that destroys the narrative that the government has everything under control. The truth is, they don't. They're losing the bush, they're losing the tradies, they're losing the small business owners. And once they lose the middle class, the whole machine comes unstuck. That's why the spin doctors worked overtime to call it a minor disruption, when in reality, it was a full-blown mutiny in broad daylight. And mutinies don't just happen in a vacuum. They spread. You want to know why the crowd in Ballarat was so hostile? Because people have had enough of watching their communities gutted while city elites pretend everything's fine. Imagine you're a farmer who's worked your land for generations, and suddenly you're told by bureaucrats who've never had dirt under their fingernails that half your paddock is now off limits because it's earmarked for some green energy project. Or worse, some international company is sniffing around, wanting to buy up your water rights so they can flog it overseas. And when you complain, what do you get? A lecture about climate change from a bloke who flies to climate conferences on private jets. Of course the farmers booed. Of course they were furious. They're not stupid. They can see when the system is rigged against them. But here's the part that'll rattle cages. This anger isn't just about farming anymore. It's about culture, identity, and control. Out in the regions, people feel like their way of life is being erased piece by piece. The traditions, the values, the independence, all of it's being replaced by rules cooked up in cities where people couldn't tell a sheep from a goat. And then they turn on the tally and see the same politicians who strangled their industries getting cheered on at fancy events in Sydney and Melbourne. It's like being robbed in broad daylight and then being told to clap for the thief. No wonder they're turning hostile. It's not about left versus right anymore, it's about us versus them. City versus country. Ordinary Aussies versus elites who think they know better. And this is where it gets properly controversial. Because while Aussies are fuming about being ignored, America's already shown what happens when the anger boils over. Donald Trump walking back into the White House as the 47th president is the perfect example. The bloke didn't win because he charmed the establishment. He won because ordinary Americans felt so ignored, so disrespected, that they'd rather back a chaos merchant than go back to business as usual. And now Australians are watching that play out and thinking, hang on, if they can revolt, why can't we? That's what scares the hell out of Canberra. Because once people realize they don't have to play by the old rules, the game changes forever. Meanwhile, Susan Ley stepping up as the first female leader of the opposition should have been a big moment. It should have been celebrated as groundbreaking, a fresh start. But instead, it barely registered with the public. Why? Because people don't believe new faces mean new ideas. They see Ley and think, great, another career politician in a fancy suit who's going to tell us what's good for us. And that's the most damning thing of all. Australians aren't even excited by political change anymore. They're numb. That numbness, though, is dangerous, because numbness eventually flips into rage. And rage doesn't care who's in charge, it just wants to burn the whole system down. Now, let's get back to Ballarat for a sec, because it wasn't just about Albanese getting booed. It was about Jacinta Allen too, the Premier of Victoria, standing there trying to sell her government's policies while farmers heckled her into silence. She copped it hard, and rightly so. This is the same Premier who pushes endless projects in Melbourne, spends billions on infrastructure blowouts, but when it comes to rural towns, suddenly there's no money. Ballarat gave her the reception she deserved. The farmers saw through the slick talking points and gave her a reality check she won't forget in a hurry. And the best part? It wasn't organized by activists or unions, it was ordinary people who simply had enough. That's what makes it powerful. This wasn't a stunt. It was raw, unfiltered anger. And don't think this anger stops at state or federal politics. It's bleeding into every debate, immigration, housing, energy, you name it. That pamphlet I mentioned earlier, the one pointing out migration numbers, caused a meltdown in Canberra. But outside the bubble, people are whispering the same thing over beers at the pub. Isn't this too much, too fast? And when they see politicians crying racism instead of addressing the problem, they tune out. Because deep down, Australians aren't against migrants. They're against being ignored. They're against being told they're racist for pointing out that their kids can't buy a house or that their hospitals are overflowing. And once you dismiss those concerns as bigotry, you lose them forever. That's what the pollies don't get. People don't care about political correctness when their rent's gone up 50% in a year. Now here's where it all ties together. Rural Aussies are fed up with being patronized. City Aussies are struggling to keep up with the cost of living. Migrants are frustrated because they were promised a land of opportunity but found gridlock and chaos. And through it all, the political class just keeps pretending everything's fine, but it's not fine. The anger that boiled over in Ballarat is spreading, and once it hits the cities, things are going to get real messy. People will stop booing and start demanding. They'll stop chasing politicians out of town and start asking harder questions. Who's really running the show? Why are decisions being made that don't make sense for ordinary Aussies? And who benefits from all this chaos? And if you reckon the government can just sweep it under the rug, think again. Ballarat wasn't a one-off. It was a warning. A sign that ordinary Australians have had enough of being sidelined while their leaders prance around on the world stage. And if the politicians don't wake up soon, they're not just going to face angry farmers, they're going to face an entire nation that's ready to flip the table. And trust me, when Aussies get to that point, it won't be polite. It'll be brutal, it'll be loud, and it'll shake the foundations of power in this country like nothing we've ever seen before. And here's the thing, mate, once that fuse is lit, there's no putting it out. The farmers booing in Ballarat was just the start, a dress rehearsal for the bigger reckoning that's coming. Because what happens when the anger spreads beyond the bush? Imagine the same fury hitting Sydney or Melbourne, where the cracks are already obvious. Rents are sky high, mortgages are crushing families, hospitals are stretched to breaking point. You reckon people in the suburbs are going to sit quietly while politicians tell them to tighten their belts and do their part for the climate? Not a chance. They'll take a leaf out of the farmer's book, and instead of letters to the editor, they'll be out in the streets. And when that happens, Canberra won't know what's hit it. The most infuriating bit is watching our leaders pretend like none of this is real. Albanese comes back from these international junkets with a smug grin, talking about global leadership and climate commitments, while his own people can't afford groceries. Jacinta Allen keeps promising projects that never get delivered, while rural hospitals close and country roads crumble into pothole-ridden death traps. Susan Ley, for all the history she's made, hasn't yet proved she's any different from the rest. And people can smell it. They can smell the spin, the empty promises, the hollow words. It's like cheap perfume sprayed over a rubbish bin. No matter how strong it is, everyone still knows it stinks underneath. Now here's where it gets properly wild. You want to know why people are turning off from politics altogether? Because it doesn't matter who you vote for, the same policies keep coming back like a bad hangover. Net zero, migration surges, endless handouts to corporations while small businesses are crushed. It doesn't matter if it's Labour or Liberal, the script never changes. People see that and start asking the dangerous questions. Who's really calling the shots? Is it the government we elected? Or is it faceless lobbyists, foreign investors, and global organizations pulling the strings? And once Aussies start digging into that, it's game over for the spin machine. Because nothing terrifies the establishment more than people realizing how little power their vote actually has. And let's be real, the media's part of the problem. They'll cover celebrity scandals for days, but when the Prime Minister is literally chased out of a country town, they downplay it. They don't want to show the cracks in the system because their job is to keep people calm, compliant, distracted. They give you a steady diet of fluff while hiding the fact that ordinary Aussies are seething. But the internet's blown that cover wide open. Clips of the booing in Ballarat are everywhere online, being shared faster than the mainstream can bury them. And that's why the elites are so desperate to control what we see and hear, because they know once the truth spreads, their grip loosens. But here's the kicker, Aussies aren't just angry anymore, they're starting to laugh at the absurdity of it all. They see Albanese ducking questions, Allen dodging farmers, senators crying on the floor about pamphlets, and they think, these are the people running the country? What a joke. And once people start laughing at their leaders, it's over. Respect's gone. Authority's gone. And what's left? Just a bunch of clowns in suits, clinging to power while the audience boos louder and louder. The politicians think they're in control, but they're not. They're just actors in a play that the crowd is walking out of. And don't underestimate the cultural shift bubbling under the surface. When Trump stormed back into the White House, it wasn't just an American story. It was a signal to every fed-up voter around the world that the establishment can be beaten, that the so-called untouchables can be dragged down. And Australians are watching, taking notes, waiting for their moment. Because deep down, people here know the system's broken. They know the same elites who tell them to sacrifice for the planet are cashing checks from the very industries destroying it. They know the same politicians who tell them to welcome more migrants don't live in the suburbs where housing's impossible. And they know the same leaders who tell them to trust the system couldn't survive a day without their taxpayer perks. That knowledge? That's dynamite. And look, I'm not saying Aussies are ready to storm Parliament tomorrow. But the seeds are there, and they're growing fast. Every rent hike, every power bill shock, every insult from a politician who doesn't get it, it all adds up. And when the dam finally bursts, it won't be polite debates or parliamentary inquiries. It'll be raw, messy, unapologetic rage. Just like Ballarat, but on a national scale. And if our leaders think they can control that with a few PR stunts and empty speeches, they're dreaming. Because once people stop believing in the system, they don't come back. They build their own. So here we are, staring down a future where the old rules don't apply anymore. The elites can keep pretending, but the crowd's waking up. The farmers booing in Ballarat weren't just angry locals. They were the voice of a nation that's sick of being ignored, silenced, and patronized. And if Canberra doesn't listen, then Canberra's in for a shock. Because the people who put them in power can just as easily take it away. And when that day comes, it won't be quiet, it won't be gentle, and it sure as hell won't be polite. It'll be the loudest wake-up call this country's ever had. See you in the next one, and don't forget to slap that like button like it just sold off your local hospital to pay for another overseas junket. Oi, and if you're really fired up, grab the "Can I vote for a kangaroo" shirt, wear it to the next rate hike meeting, the next protest, or just your local cafe when you're forking out $9 for a flat white while wondering why your tax dollars are fixing someone else's country instead of ours. Stay loud, stay awake, and never stop fighting for the Australia we bloody deserve.